saw a meme recently about language, and it really was provocative. It talked about how we have this violent connection to language and we have to change it. So from we're going to pull the trigger, we say we're going to launch. I'll take a stab at it. We should say I'll take a first pass at it. Basically looking at the power of how some violent language has been infused in our way of speaking, and we should change that. And it really got me thinking about what the evolution of language is and what we can glean from this one meme is like, we don't want to lose all style and flourishes just because something is offending a group of people. And I'm not saying it's not a great idea to think about this, and I'm going to post this meme in my reply to this, but it got me thinking, it got a few of my friends thinking, and we're saying, wow, you know, language is this living, breathing thing. Who knows more about language than David Peterson, who makes up language? He won this contest and he was able to create the fictional language of Game of Thrones. He's done a bunch of cool stuff. So I just want to start this conversation, and I'm not sure where it's going to go, but it's going to be filled with lots of language. The first thing is David's going to hopefully respond to this meme about the evolution of language insofar as it's sort of including images that are violent. And is that something that we do a lot? Is that something that we're not conscious of, or we are conscious of? And then when we get conscious of it, is it weird to undo that and to sound kind of prescribed? I don't know, but I think it's worth starting this conversation about that. And kind of go from there. So if you're a big fan of David's, I'm sure you're thrilled that he's here. You can look him up online, just type in David Peterson and Game of Thrones, and boom, you can learn about him. But today we're going to just dig into, you know, how we form language now in 2023. Of course, it's helpful to look back, so we're going to do that. But let's just move forward here. So, language creator David, thank you for being here. You're awesome to be here, and I hope you enjoy this back and forth with me and with other folks that come on. Tell me what you think of this meme that I'm posting right here. What do you think of it? What does it conjure up for you? And as promised, here's that image of language that's been infused with violent images.
I'm guessing that because this isn't a restricted conversation, that it's okay to jump in here before David arrives. I'll be interested to hear what he has to say, because looking at this meme, on the one hand, overarching idea of eliminating violent language from our lexicons, I get that. On the other hand, some of the items listed as quote-unquote violent language, I think it's funny to me because there are certain phrases there that can be interpreted as violent, but can also be interpreted in other ways. And so when we have so many words that have multiple definitions in themselves, are we going to decide that because it has at least one negative, one violent definition, then that is the interpretation we're going to take out of that particular sentence when someone uses it, instead of any other nuance and complexity? And then when I look at for instance, stab at it or blown away. Both of those, I think, can be interpreted in multiple different ways. You could look at it as a violent language, sure, but that's only one interpretation. And not a bad idea. I don't think that there's anything negative or quote-unquote violent there. And to offer the options that are listed as alternatives, I think are stripped down, reductive in some ways, and losing the complexity and nuance of the phrases on the left. That's not to say that I think perpetuating violent language is a good thing, but when we're offering alternatives that are stripped down and losing complexity and nuance to the way that we communicate, because in my mind, it's not really about the vocabulary words themselves, it's about communication. It's about understanding. And certain phrases convey far more. Beating a dead horse versus, let's not focus on that anymore, that doesn't convey the exact idea of what's meant by not beating a dead horse anymore. And so am I for using that phrase consistently? No, not necessarily, but I think then we have to be more creative in the options we come up as alternatives, and that requires effort. And a lot of people either can't or aren't interested in the effort required to do that. And I think that then when we start to choose reductive options to replace the violent language, in a sense, that is destroying the complexity of the ways that we communicate. I mean, for example, bite the bullet versus take a pass at it, if I'm remembering those two correctly. Bite the bullet conveys not just starting or taking the initial pass at it. There's like anxiety sort of woven in there. It's not only the literal meaning of what they're trying to convey of their actions, but there's also emotion attached to it too. There's more nuance there than simply saying I'm going to take the first pass at it. Anyway, I'm going to stop rambling now, and I'm curious to hear what David has to say.
As someone who speaks several languages, I'm also very interested in what David has to say. So there's a couple of points here. One, when we're talking about language in this post, really we're talking about English language. Other languages do not have these idiomatic expressions, and they don't have the same kind of violence built into the language itself. Also, what is considered violent within a culture is exactly that, quite cultural. It is really interesting how English has a very large amount of violent language kind of woven in. But if you look at the history, for example, of the United States, in the case of American English, it is not very strange because life was very tough for 13 colonies to go and annihilate historically many native peoples who lived there, take their land. Everything was violence-based. People bore arms. And so language is a direct reflection of culture. Now, the other thing that's also very interesting, for example, when we're talking about emotional expression and intimacy, in English, almost everything that is connotatively negative is expressed through a feminine for. So a man is a pussy, or don't be a bitch, or, there's so many ways in which derogatory language is feminized. This is also a cultural thing because, for example, in Italian, if you want to say a man is really cool, you feminize the language to make him really cool. And that reflects directly a cultural aspect of the values that lie therein. I love building languages as well. They're super interesting. I've studied many more languages than those I speak fluently for the same reason that there is definitely some kind of neurological response that we have towards certain sounds. And so if you look even at one of the great masters of fiction writers, who is J.R. Tolkien, in the creation of language, he studied very carefully like how language actually affects different parts of our feeling. So he was able to create the Elven language, for example, based on certain sounds and subsets of sounds, and the Dwarven language and the language of men, etc., etc. So very, very interesting. I'm very curious as well to hear what David has to say. I am a big language nerd. I've studied linguistics formally, but I also just am kind of immersed in everything language. So looking forward to hearing what comes next.
Thank you to Deborah for inviting me to this conversation. Also, this is the first time I've ever used this app, so it took a little bit of familiarizing. So sorry for the late reply. Something that's interesting about anytime a meme like this gets shared is that there's a couple of ways of doing it. One thing would just be to share one expression and then share, a possible alternative. And the other is a whole list. So I'm sure that many people, if not most people who read this, had the reaction where it's like, oh, that seems like a good idea to replace that. Or it's like, well, but I don't know necessarily if I agree with that one. I don't necessarily think this alternative is better than the original or conveys the exact same thing and so on. It's too many to engage with one by one. The first thing that I want to note is whenever you're looking at something like this, metaphor is being used, but metaphor in the conceptual sense. And so when it comes to conceptual metaphor, I really want to recommend a book that was written by George Lakoff and Mark Johnson called Metaphors We Live By. It was written in, I want to say 1975, University of Chicago Press. It's come out, they came out with a new edition in 2001, I think. But this is a book I recommend because it's short, You don't need a background in linguistics to understand it. It's very comprehensible. It's very 70s when you read it. So, read it with a grain of salt. Can you read something with a grain of salt? I don't know. Anyway, you can take it with one. But George Lakoff and Mark Johnson explained that the nature of metaphor is far more pervasive than we would ordinarily believe. So it's one thing to everybody recognizes metaphor like it is the East and she is the East and Juliet is the sun, or it is the East and Juliet is the sun, right? But metaphor absolutely pervades all language, and this isn't just English. This is all languages all over the world. Conceptual metaphor is simply a way of using concrete language to discuss things that are not concrete. So, for example, saying that you're in love, for example, just something very simple, and you think like, well, there's no other way to say that. That's true, but I want you to think about the preposition in. Why that one? Well, it's because we have this overriding metaphor in English, and many languages have this metaphor, that emotions or states are containers. And so if you are, in love, you are within this container, you're within this state, and that it is holding you, and that's why we use in. You could also fall out of love and things like that. He spoke in anger, for example. You see lots of these expressions that happen all over the place. But the point is that metaphor like this is often a very small thing, and so crucial, so intrinsic to the way that we use language all the time that we don't even notice it. And that's what I want to pick up on, this idea. There are essentially two types of metaphors, and it's a continuum, but there's metaphors that we recognize, that speakers actively recognize, and metaphors that we don't really think about so much anymore, kind of dead metaphors. Some of these are quite active, but some of them that we don't really think about, and some we completely lost the original thread of. So, for example, saying that something doesn't hold water, it's an expression that goes all the way back through many different European languages, way, 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 way back to the idea that the condition of dropsy, where an affliction that occurs to somebody who's drunk too much water, or they start to swell up with water, doesn't tell the truth. And so this is ultimately where it doesn't hold water comes to from us. But like nobody knows that anymore. And so it doesn't mean anything. Like when you say it doesn't hold water, it's not like we're saying anything meaningful about dropsy. Similarly, many people have forgotten that cut to the chase refers to movies and refers to cutting to the chasing to move ahead in the action. So that's where we hit this list and have to ask ourselves, all right, how active are these things in our mind? How much do we fully engage with them? Or to what extent are they completely dead? And then once we've made that decision, then we have to decide what exactly do we want to do about it. This is part one, and now I'll get to part two. Something truly incredible happened in the late 90s. So I was born in 1981. And I went to high school from 1995 to 1999. And at that time, let me tell you, there, when you wanted to call somebody, when you wanted to insult somebody, the absolute first thing that everybody jumped for was gay. Whether it was a person or whether it was an idea or a thing, just to call somebody a generic insult, you say, "Oh, that's gay." Which was the equivalent of saying that's dumb. And it was pervasive. Everybody did it. And of course, there were also stronger terms that were also used. And something really incredible happened, not in the late 90s. So I was in high school in the late 90s. It was the early 2000s, where, of course, homosexuality was becoming more socially acceptable and more widely understood. And a lot of people, both people my age, but also people older, were beginning to reflect on what exactly, their relationship was to homosexuality and homosexual people that they've known. They started to examine some of the things that they had said and done in their past life, and were like, you know what, this wasn't necessarily a good thing. We thought of it as just whatever, but really it wasn't. And the incredible thing that I found was there was a television commercial that featured a lot of NBA players. Um, some of which were on one of my favorite teams, which my favorite team was the Phoenix Suns, and it featured a number of their players. And there was at least one WNBA player on this as well. And the commercial was nothing else than simply a PSA to say, "Hey, stop saying gay to mean bad." And I was like, "Wow, look at that, an actual commercial." And the thing that was incredible to me is that it worked for the most part. An odd thing to take a look at was for me to kind of like as a hallmark of how things had changed was the movie 21 Jump Street. I used to watch 21 Jump Street, the television show, when I was a kid. And so then the movie came out and I was like, it didn't look anything similar, like, whatever. But I put it on, it was very funny. And there are these guys, dressing up to pretend that they're high school students. And they're walking through the parking lot, and there's an interaction where the guy who's older, pretending to be a high school student, he's making fun of somebody. He's, "Dude, what are you, gay?" And the kid says, "Yeah, so what?" And his friends back him up and say, "Yeah, what's wrong with you? Are you saying there's something wrong with that?" It's like, and suddenly he's realizing, oh my God, there's been a culture change here. You can't just do that anymore. And suddenly I look like a jerk. And, he was. I thought that was really incredible. And so the point is, like, uh, language as it is, it's something that just passes on totally passively. You can't really change it very aggressively, but we can. I mean, we, the speakers, can get together and decide as a community, you know what, maybe this thing isn't so good. Maybe we should change. And sometimes it's effective. And there are lots, I think, of expressions, especially racist ones, that are slowly falling out of the language because people have recognized what they are, have recognized that they were racist if they were just dead metaphors at that point. That is, if they didn't know what their origins were, and they phased them out. So when it comes to something like this, so you have the violent language, this is basically another cultural conversation. A linguist would simply note it and say, here are expressions that are in use. And if they fall out of use, then they fall out of use. But really, it's not so much of a language thing, it's more of a culture thing. We need to decide, does this really activate, violence for us, or is it more of a dead metaphor? And if we do recognize it, is it something that's important enough to us that we want to cut it out? I mean, for me, some of these, it's like, some of them are like, I bet you can use something else for that without losing too much of the meaning. Others, it's like, I don't think that's a big deal. But really, it's just something that is something we need to discuss collectively. Somebody's made the suggestion, it's great. And so now what happens? We discuss it and say, well, does this hold water or not? And essentially decide, are we going to reflectively change our own speech and suggest that others do as well? So those are my thoughts.
David, thanks so much for your replies. It's so fascinating. And you point out so many things that I never even thought about. I want to go back to Aria, who's also a linguist who joined us, because she mentioned Daryl Tolkien and, the fantastical world that you traverse now, David, of creating languages for science fiction and for helping us kind of imagine ourselves out of like what we know. And I want to ask you, because she brought that up, and the love of taking us into a realm that's not our normal realm. I think that it would be wonderful for people to use the tool of getting out of expectation to see things in a different way. I know that sometimes when you take drawing classes, they say, draw with your non-dominant hand, and you won't believe how much you'll discover about yourself, because you don't judge your non-dominant hand because you can't draw with it. So what happens is you engage different parts of your brain and things wake up and some part of you is discovered. Similarly, when you create language, David, you dive into a fantastical culture, and I know so much goes into that. But the reason I title this swell about is language living or dying, it makes me wonder how helpful it is for all of us to see things through the discomfort of not knowing the language, and the surrender to that discomfort. So can you talk a little bit about foreign language, like as a concept, and discomfort, and what happens to the human brain when it doesn't know a language? How do we respond and engage in that discomfort? And is it a positive thing, or is it an expansive thing?
Thank you for looping me back in, Deborah. And David, thank you so much for kicking off such an interesting discussion around metaphors. To your point, metaphor exists in every language because it's simply a way that the human brain attempts to explain and correlate things that may appear unrelated or out of cultural context, and maybe be a way to elucidate meaning that may not be so simple to fully understand at first glance. So all cultures have formed some form of art around the employment of conceptual metaphor. In a sense, yes, metaphor pervades language because images pervade mind. We are primarily visual creatures, and as such, we often think in images before we're thinking in words. So the way we structure meaning around concepts, I agree, it is driven by metaphor in all languages, at least the ones I've come across to date. And even the way we structure basic direction in language, with the cunning use of prepositions and adverbs, we frame things differently culture to culture. For example, in English, we think about somebody. In Spanish, we think in somebody. And in Italian, we might think to somebody. So even the way we frame actions and how those actions take place, kind of referring back to your point around emotions and containers, right? This is very, very interesting in terms of the cultural landscape that every language exists within. And I like Deborah's question about whether language is living or dying, because it's a really great question. In the way I've understood language, it has always been a dynamic, vivid, live system. To your point, things fall off use and they're no longer needed on the tree of syntax when we see expressions or certain metaphorical references within a language get pruned out by the collective usage. Then again, I mean, leave it to linguists to be as matter of fact towards the use of inflammatory language that might be violent, at least as much as a gynecologist might be prudish about reproductive organs and secret body parts. Are they really secret? In the same way, I'd say that, like, for example, we've lost many Victorian English contextual metaphors, right? We've now gained many more. For examples, we have everything from Googling something to being ghosted to being woke. These are just changes in colloquial usage, obviously, but the changes in technology and the shifts in global sensibilities around language change its usage. And as such, I really appreciate the point you made around the usage in the 90s around the word gay that used to be extremely derogatory and then became cool and not derogatory when people's awareness caught on as a collective. I also thought that was incredible as a shift to see. And we are also seeing a similar trend now with all of the different orientations, as well as with the word autism. Like, as the shift happens collectively, we're seeing more and more these shifts in usage. You know that famous Wittgenstein quote, "The limits of my language are the limits of my world," or something like that. There's some truth to that. And I would also counter that there are many forms of communication. So at some moment, when those forms take hold in the collective usage or mind, they enter language, often through sub-pockets or subcultures. And that's why subcultures are so important to the change in language. And when they enter language, they often come through metaphorical modes of transmission. And world building is so much fun. So when creating new languages that don't exist, I'd imagine one of the most fascinating aspects is to imagine how sociologically a mechanism may happen within that cultural context, and then create metaphors from there that are uniquely cultural to that fictional world or race or whatever. Because learning language is creating more than just language. It isn't just creating words that fit together in sentences that sound not English. It's a language that is a reflection of a whole cultural paradigm, including learning and approach to love, hate, death, religion. A language means learning a culture. So with a culture that is fictional, there would be many parameters that would have to be established to make that language have a sensical flow. That's super exciting. I'm really looking forward to your thoughts on the discomfort of foreign language, as Deborah put it, and just some of your thoughts in terms of what your experience has been with creating and shaping language. I really am really fascinated with this topic. So I'll stay tuned.
Hey, Deborah, thanks so much for sharing an interesting swell, as always. And David and everybody else on this thread. It's a fascinating conversation. Just to add, from a corporate standpoint, I actually had done a podcast many moons ago and written an article on it as well. Reference to context is the level of excellence that's being defined in major corporates these days, and it's been on for a while, has all negative connotation words attached to it. Give an example of a sales workshop. It was just a training workshop for 2 days. It was branded as the extreme sales workshop. I questioned the management at the time, why call it extreme? And I was promptly shut down. And it's like, hey, its ideas to be sharp and it requires extreme effort. We often hear many notable tech leaders who use the word maniacal, that they've been maniacal about it, or they're obsessed about it. Yet if used in different connotation, being obsessed could also lead you in trouble, isn't it? So, but you can obsess about a customer, but you can't obsess about your lover. Then you can choke them, metaphorically and literally speaking. And so in everyday work language, there is this, even if you look at the job descriptions, they always are looking for a Superman, the extreme form of man. Like, whatever happened to poor old Clark Kent? Are we missing Clark Kent in search of Superman? So, and there lies the irony as well, right? Turns out there is only one Superman and he might not need a job. But that apart, everything is about extreme performance. And then who does these extreme performances are those people who are extreme. Would you want that? That doesn't sound too right? Extreme people, we don't like them. Okay. Conversely, do we become mediocre then? Because if you want someone to be balanced, then that is mediumistic, i.e. mediocre. You don't want that either. So you don't want extreme. You don't want mediumistic. What do you want? And how do you articulate that? What adjective do you use to define excellence? So we have had extreme sales workshop, killer contests, blown in hell, or, nail it. And everything is very aggressive and violent. And I often have questioned, at least in my environment, that can we not have something very simple, may the best person win, something like that. And it's like, that's so boring. I mean, how could you get a whole workforce excited by a simple statement? You need something which can stir them up. I said, yes, but why would you stir them up negatively? So that debate still rages on, and yet we have one extreme contest over the other with derivatives of some form of aggression or the other. Then the counter argument there was, each generation advanced noise than its previous generation. The boomers were more noisier than the silent generation. The Gen X were more noisier than the boomers, and clearly the current generation, Gen X or Gen I, whatever you call it, is the most vocal. And so the vocabulary over generations has also become more aggressive, quote unquote, louder. And because so much of it is happening, therefore it warrants an extreme reaction to be noticed. There's nothing that can be done simply, plainly anymore, I guess. My question to all you fine people out there is, what is the threshold of such extreme verbiage? Have we peaked yet, or are we yet to reach a next level of extreme vocabulary, or do you see it circling back to its origins, where as all things, have what goes around comes around, and look at it as a cyclical thing, that we will probably revert back to very plain, simple, easy language in the future. Would love to hear some thoughts.
This was such a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for having it. And as I was hearing it, I was seeing Anno Anna. That's like a Futharth, elder Futharth runic type of a word, which has, I would say, a literal meaning and like a philosophical one. And the thing goes, assume you are running full speed towards an animal that is like say 10 times your size, right? Say I'm running full speed towards an elephant or a bison or something like that, or a rhino, right? And we collide. Obviously, Anno Anna, I'm gone. I'll be splattered in so many directions, because it's the human body, no matter how strong you build it, it's so fragile against a lot of nature. However, Anno Anna tells us that when that happens, forget about the body, but it's also the merging of the souls. It's when I heard this, I realized that words do have that power, right? There's the literal meaning, there's the metaphorical meaning, and then there's the meaning that comes in play once context and comprehension enters the chat. A lot of why I believe language is living. I mean, if look at how language evolved. We used to grunt at each other, and from there to using hyper specific, we have a word to describe the light coming through the place in trees where trees refuse to touch each other. We have a word for the smell of the ground when the rain first hits the ground, signifying month. We have such hyper specific words, right? And it all came from us grunting at each other, going, manhunt in pack, there's a lion there, or I need to sleep. I don't know what those grunts were specifically, but that's where human speech kind of began, grunting at each other. And from there on, we have started, like I would say, evolving, right? Or I would say breathing life into the process of communication, right? And a lot of it has to do with context, a lot of it has to do with comprehension, because context is going to give, I would say, the meaning or the meanings to the word, right? In Japanese, for instance, there are so many words with multiple meanings. I say ame, it could be rain or candy, right? But the way you say ame will determine the meaning. Ame. It's awe-inspiring how every single language has something of this sort, where words that sound similar but have meanings that are completely unrelated to each other, right? So this is where I suppose comprehension comes in play. Context is going to anchor these things in the dictionary, and comprehension is going to come in and check whether those words hold true anymore. Nice is one of my favorite examples to give of this phenomena, which has roots, I think, which has French roots. And the meaning of nice in English when it was adopted used to be precise. And now we don't use nice for precision at all. We use it for, oh yeah, it's nice, right? So I love the living aspect of language. Language, I believe, has always been a living organism, and we began from grunts. We went into, I would say, hyper specificity, and now I believe because of the intersection of binary with like our language, we are going back to, I would say, shortening a lot. maybe. So yes, my vote is language is definitely living, and it is such a wonderful evolving entity. It's my life's obsession, to be honest. Yes. Thank you.
That is such a fascinating take on this. English, or rather, each language has something baked into it, courtesy of the culture, the history that shaped the language in the first place. So I'm from Gujarat. I speak Gujarati. Gujarat is on the west of India. Looks like a little lion. Anyway, a lot of, I would say, areas around Gujarat, courtesy of the docking position, right, where a lot of ships could sail into harbor and then go away, we had a lot of trade happening via Gujarat historically. And so obviously a lot of Gujarati has, I would say, trade-centric words, trade-centric idioms, and trade-centric, like, I would say, aphorisms. And I never really thought there was logic behind that. I was just like, just Gujarati things. But it now that you said what you did, so fascinating. I think it makes so much sense. I've noticed this while learning Japanese as well. The different accents, whether it's the one you hear in Osaka, no, not just the accents, the word choice, I would say, around Osaka, around someone who's grown up and currently lives in Tokyo. And it's fascinating how the same language kind of changes delivery, right? Based on, I would say, the historic predominant situation, trade, etc., of the people involved. This is fascinating. Thank you so much for this. I'm going to analyze this a lot more, I think, because I know that culture largely shapes language, but there are multiple sides to a culture as well, right? I mean, culture is not just violence, it is not just trade, it is not just the cuisine, it's not just the attire, it's so many of these things coming together, and then like one or two of these traits kind of dominate the rest. How it ends up happening and all of that. Yes. Thank you so much for this. It's fascinating. This thing you highlighted, I mean, I experienced this a little bit while I was reading the Corporate Feminist Manifesto, referred to as Lean In by Sheryl Sandberg. Reading this book, as I was reading this book, I had this, I would say, radioactive metallic taste in my mouth going, there is a subtext here of something cruel, right? Something so dismissive and so formulaic. Like, I couldn't put my hand on it, what it was specifically to this date. And I just thought, maybe I'm being like, young and arrogant and something of that sort, who could not see the power of leaning in. And hearing you kind of, I'm going to go back to lean in and, see it with this perspective as well. I couldn't really put my hands on why I didn't really like the book. I'm having similar problems with Shreyana Bhattacharya's Desperately Seeking Shahrukh, which is not about Shahrukh at all. It's about the Indian women and the kind of personal and professional struggles they face as they navigate a country that is stuck in traditions but is trying to be like, modern and cool and everything. So I a lot of this probably has to do with how language in public policy, speaking to Shreyana's book, and how language incorporates, speaking to Sheryl Sandberg's book. Yes, this makes so much sense. I have homework for next 3 weeks because of this swell. I'm loving it. Also, unrelated to what you said about language incorporates. I think if you haven't encountered Keigo already, which is formal Japanese used in Japanese corporates, oh, Ayan, it's exquisite. Like, I'm laughing because saying one line in an email has to be 3 paragraphs, which involves 1 paragraph of small talk that nobody is interested in and almost everyone skips. There's 1 paragraph of like niceties, and then there is like the actual stuff that you want to say, but you can't just come out and say it. You have to like Keigo it. It's brilliant. I'm being sarcastic, but yes, if you haven't had a taste of Keigo yet, please check it out. I think you will really enjoy Indian business corporate conversation when you compare it to that, because at least हमारे यहाँ थोड़ा direct है, right? People would just go get this done, or something passive aggressive like as per our last meeting or call, I told you this, so you need it's still pretty direct. But Japanese corporates are like, hold my sake. It's I took me such a long time to adjust because I am used to writing direct emails, right? And that is absolutely seen as rude behavior. So look into it and bask in the glory that is direct emails from Indian corporates. Yes.
Vinati, what a wonderful response. Yes, I lived in Ahmedabad as a child, so I remember Gujarat quite well. You were absolutely right. It is so interesting how language as this living thing shifts and changes, even with people that live, even if you go like area to area, like if you go to Pune, you go to Mumbai, like the way people speak, even Hindi, changes completely. Or if you look at Spanish in Latin America, it's like one Spanish language and many Spanish languages, and there's variations in all of those in one language. English is no different. There's American English, there's Australian English, there's South African English, there's British English, there's Indian English. It changes so much, and the expressions that are used, even within one language, are completely regional. And they're like, if you get somebody from India speaking English and you get somebody from South Africa, they're going to have completely different expressions in the same language because of the regions that they live in and because of the influence of all of the ethnic languages around them. So yes, it's very interesting. And I liked your point about the various layers of semantics that exist from the literal meanings of words to the metaphors that are used, as well as the deeper philosophical words. Like there are many words in different languages, even in Japanese, right, that don't exist. I mean, literally the word does not exist in another culture because that culture never framed that concept. So there is no word for it. And this is interesting, and this is what I love about studying languages, is finding all the ways that humans have found to frame perspective. Anyway, thank you so much for your comment. I as well will be studying this much more and giving it some more thought, and look very much forward to the rest of this conversation.
Hey, Deborah. I know that you were hoping I would say something about language, or were asking me to talk about foreign language, but I'd actually like to go closer to home and talk about literature and kind of the purpose of language, as it exists, because you don't actually have to go further than that, I think, to get the idea. Language itself is kind of a grand compromise and exists on 2 spectrums between 2 poles. There's, kind of minimalism and maximalism, or economy and explicitness, in that it would be maximally efficient if all of our languages had just one word that was just one syllable, and then we could speak very, very quickly. The problem is it would be very hard to understand what we meant if everybody just said the same thing, like duh, for example. It wouldn't, there wouldn't be enough information there for us to decode what our mental intent was. At the same time, being over explicit is not something we tend to like to do. Our languages are not overly explicit, and even the way we use them is not overly explicit, because you can just imagine if somebody says how what do you want, and you say like I'd like a bottle of water or something like that, and to be maximally explicit, you'd have to say something like, I have heard exactly what you have said in this moment, and you say the exact time and date and where exactly you are. I've acknowledged what you've said. This is what I understood you to have said. These are my thoughts. This is the thoughts that sprung to mind when you said that. And this is the type of action that I wish to see in the world as a result of that which you have said, and go on and on and on and on and on, just to say that you want a bottle of water. I mean, you imagine you could do that, but it's really not necessary and becomes a little tedious. And so when we express ourselves somewhere in between those two. Similarly, there's another spectrum, which is that lies between conventionality and novelty. So for example, it's easier to understand something that you've heard already. But you can imagine if you could only ever utter that which you had already heard, it would be difficult to express new ideas. Or if you could only say a word that you had heard before in exactly that context, pretty much it would just stifle all communication, because ultimately we have new experiences and we want to express them. At the same time, it wouldn't work to be totally novel. That is, every single utterance you utter is an entirely new word that you just invented using an entirely different phonological system and an entirely different language. The one thing that holds language together is consistency, and something that was where it's like every single expression was entirely novel. Perhaps even as the expression went on, communication would be impossible. And so as a result, the way that we communicate lies somewhere in between novelty and, conventionality, right? And the best way to actually see that is in literature, because, and we're not even moving to other languages, just within our own language. Writers are pressing the boundaries of what language can do every single time they release a new book. They're saying things in ways that have never been said before, and for different reasons. So, for example, one of the ones I like to come back to is Samuel Beckett's novel. This is part of a trilogy called No How On. He has this novel called Worst Word Ho that makes absolutely no sense when you read it, or at least at the outset of it. Here's an example of it. Say for be said, missaid. From now say for missaid. Say a body, where none, no mind, where none, that at least, a place, where none, for the body, to be in, move in, out of, back into, no, no out, no back, only in, stay in, on in, still. Those are all sentences. And it doesn't make any sense. And yet then, like, you kind of get something from it, and then he produces something that was really quite beautiful. All of old, nothing else ever, ever tried, ever failed, no matter, try again, fail better. And suddenly he's used this new way of speaking to express something that's really profound in a totally unique way. In addition, you can also use, totally new and what we might say as non-convenient forms of expressions to express humor. So there's this great line from Douglas Adams from one of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxies, who may have been the first one. But he has this line: the ships hung in the sky in much the same way that bricks don't, which is not the most conventional way of saying that the ships were, floating in the sky or anything like that. But it's something that expressed in such an oddball way, in a way that you've never heard before, that it makes you chuckle, it makes you think, and so that's kind of the type of thing when it comes to language and expression. And partly the reason that, for example, going back to the original point of the thread, part of the reason that these expressions stick around so much is that they kind of hit the person who hears them the first time in totally the right way, where it's like, oh my goodness, I never thought of that before. Imagine the first person who ever said that's like beating a dead horse, and that wasn't a conventional expression. You're like, wow, what a weird way to say that, but I totally get what you mean. And so it becomes popular, and people share it around, and suddenly it becomes an expression. Anyway, so that's essentially what writers are doing with literature all the time. They're trying to say things in new ways, to try to express themselves, both to express themselves clearly, but to express themselves uniquely. It's a push for novelty. And so anyway, kind of tying it back to the original thread, um, we tend to reevaluate exactly what things mean and how they mean them with each new generation. People come along, they reevaluate expressions, and far from like the idea from this thread, deciding whether language is violent and that this says something about us and whether we should shift away to less violent language. The much more prosaic version of that is often, teenagers decide certain expressions are just boring. They don't like them anymore. And they stop using them because they see them as old-fashioned or kind of like out of touch, and so they invent new ones. It's just this same both generational and very human push for novelty. So what I always think of is, when it comes to things like this, there can be success in saying, you know what, we're not going to use this expression anymore, and you try to express why, try to get people on board, and it can work. But also, you can have great success just inventing something new that people really like the sound of. Um, I have to say, for the revised list that was given in the, to like shift away from the violent language, feeding two birds, feeding two birds with one scone, was just the most ridiculous and hilarious thing I have ever heard, that I am probably going to use it, probably as a joke. But I mean, goodness gracious, feeding two birds with one scone. It's just, it's so hilarious and eye-rolly hilarious at the same time, that who knows, maybe it has a chance of succeeding. But anyway, that's two different ways you can approach it if you uh, see language that you don't like being used in the general realm. Sorry, I'm losing it myself. I've had one of those days where I had a nap and I woke up and the world was suddenly different. Uh, anyway, I'm going to take a listen to some of the other replies now. I want to pick up on something you said at the end here, and also talk about language creation at the same time, because I think you hit on something quite key, which is that there are certainly trends when it comes to idioms, when it comes to expressions, when it comes to metaphor in a language, but and there's also, of course, going to be certain subcultures that become more, I guess, more well known or celebrated than others. But a language is for all of its speakers, not just some of them. So, for example, you could take a look at just expressions from English that are highly misogynist, and come to the conclusion that English is a misogynist language. But of course, there are plenty of other expressions in English. Uh, there are plenty that are benign, plenty that are, for example, you come up with a whole host of expressions that have to do purely with film and television, especially film and television, or film from the early 20th century. And come to the conclusion that, well, then the English language is just about film and Hollywood. But I mean, the truth is that it's all those things at the same time. And not only that, it's all of those things kind of like vying for attention at various points in our history. And at a certain point, they just become reminders of the history of the people that have spoken that language. So when it comes to creating a new language, for a fictional culture, for example, I'm doing roughly the same thing. The more information I can get about the people that I'm creating the language for, the better. It's one of the reasons, if you look at Song of Ice and Fire, that being Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon, it's one of the reasons that Dothraki was a lot easier to create than High Valyrian when it came to its lexicon and its idioms and its expressions, because the culture of the Dothraki is documented much more thoroughly in the books than the culture of those who spoke the Valyrian language. In the books, the Valyrian language was supposed to be the language of day-to-day communication for a culture that has been destroyed by a cataclysm, by a natural and also somewhat man-made cataclysm, to the point that most of the people at the time of telling don't know a lot about what life was like back then. There are whispers about it. There's a sense of mystery about it that's there for fictional reasons. But as the language creator, it's like, well, that was where all the expressions came from. That's the culture I need to know in order to create the language. And so it made things quite a bit more difficult. But essentially, that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to look at the history of the language, figure out what cultural trends would have been prominent in what eras, what kind of expressions would have been born in those eras, which ones would have been carried on. But at the same time, even though you're creating, popular, expressions for things that would have been popular within that culture, within that subculture, it's still everybody's language. It's not as if, you look at the average Dothraki warrior and say, oh, he's, this macho He-Man dude, very misogynist, and therefore the entire language is going to be like that. That's not the case. I mean, there's still plenty of people who aren't like that speak the language. There's tons of women who speak the language. There's older people. There's younger people. There are different generations. And so that's the type of thing where you have to take it into consideration and figure out, well, what is their language like? What expressions do they use? Which ones are common to everybody? Which ones are common to subcultures? And that's part of the fun and also part of the artistry that goes into creating a language for a fictional culture. You're figuring out all of that and figuring out that history and figuring out how it's represented in the words and expressions that the users of the language have created over the centuries, and figuring out, which ones are still around and which ones are an individual speaker going to use when you're translating dialogue, because of course translation is its own art, kind of a separate thing from language creation. But anyway, so I wanted to be sure to add that, since this entire time I haven't said a thing about created languages.
Language is for all their speakers. I'm totally going to quote you on this, because this is so true. We are so selective, I believe, especially with modern communication. We are so selective with how we kind of label languages. I was in a LinkedIn audio room type situation where someone said maths is misogynistic, and I was like, what? And it was a moment of that Homeland Security meme, right, where Claire is trying to figure out. That is what happened to me in that moment, because I couldn't process how a language could be like this one thing or this one label. Because language is such a broad word. Even if we take individual languages like, say, English or Hindi or Gujarati or all of these different languages that exist in the world, and to say that like a language is one thing, it has always, I would say, rubbed me the wrong way. And given, how I'm still in the exploratory stage with regards to many things when it comes to language, it's like I don't know how to voice it. And language is for all of their speakers. That's how I'm going to voice it moving forward. And someone just, tacks on a label to a language, because that is so unfair. Per what you said about developing language based on the people that one is creating the language for, I'm going to totally sound like a fan, but I was in college between 2011 and 2015. I would say peak Game of Thrones era in many ways. A bunch of us would genuinely get together after the college is done, and we didn't have like a lot of assignments and such, because WhatsApp was also pretty new, so people were communicating with each other a lot via their phone. We would legitimately get together and discuss like the language aspect of it, because the initial nuance that you got, right, the first time the Dothrakis, for instance, enter the scene, you are like, oh, the language is very guttural. I mean, I don't get what they are saying, but it's aggressive, right? And that is the version you have. And then the episodes go along, and then you get like, even within that guttural delivery, you see the difference in how the language is used when they are in battle or when they are negotiating versus when they are talking amongst each other and such. We used to totally nerd out. The drama club of my college, we would genuinely just nerd out over this language specificity, because we didn't have that with the books, right? This is something new that we got with the TV show. So it was so fascinating, and genuinely, like, how we say show don't tell, we could feel, it was palpable, the effort that was put into developing the language. So thank you so much for doing that. I mean, you made a bunch of nerds in college very happy, going, ooh, what could that possibly be? Every, I would say, Monday and Tuesday, because that's when we would generally meet and discuss the new Game of Thrones drop. I heard something similar on N.K. Jemison's masterclass, where she said that when developing a world, don't focus on the geography, focus on the people first. Like, what are the people trying to do? What's the predominant trade? What kind of a society is it? Is it matriarchal? Is it patriarchal? All of these like tiny little details, and then structure the geography around it. And it's wonderful when two worlds collide, right? Because ultimately the craft of storytelling, it has so much to it, and to see that a linguistic development POV and a world building development POV kind of converge together in that one insight, it's absolutely brilliant. I mean, I'm going to take up more of your time, because it's so wonderful having someone with this much experience and knowledge come at a topic like this. So yes, on to some extra thoughts per what you said to Deborah. How we choose to express ourselves, it does give us away, doesn't it? Because in literature we have subtext. A skilled author will like weave in a subtext within the narrative, and every single time I've read a Jane Austen, I'm like, oh, I feel the classism radiating through the whole thing without her actually actively commentating on it, right? Because it's woven into it, into the overall plot with subtext. We also have a version of that in everyday communication, while it is not as, I would say, subtle as subtext. It is clear, right? The way people talk to us. I think largely speaking, we can tell whether we are being talked down to or not, or whether someone is being genuine with how they are talking to us and such. It's minor things like, the tone used, the pauses. It's so fascinating that there's such ridiculous levels of deepness with something as simple as like the art of making sounds with our tongue and mouth and like all of these different organs. I also love this thing you said, which is language is held together by consistency. I think largely speaking, that is what is becoming difficult, right, with social media conversation. The consistency of language is kind of shaking a little bit because something is cool, something is not, something is super cool. This is happening within fraction of hours based on like a bunch of people who I would say are perpetually online. God, that sounded so snippy. But yes. Language is definitely held together by consistency, and never thought of phrasing it that way, but that's genuinely what it is, isn't it? Also on to something else you said, which is if you could only utter that which you've already heard, that would be so restrictive. I think with the thing about the violent language, why that rhetoric kind of, I would say, rubs me the wrong way is there's definite origins to that language or that verbiage. And if I say something suspiciously specific in terms of like a metaphor or something of that sort, I might confuse people by the, I would say, word structure, but the intention used behind that is not one to harm, right? So when we talk about straight up substituting language with something else, it definitely presents opportunities to create great satire, for sure. The scones being up. Yes, that was so true. But it also presents this, I would say, it's such a cliche to say this, but it also presents like the 1984-esque effect of language and such. And the last thing I wanted to say is the way of speaking. And I immediately remembered Flowers for Algernon, because the Flowers for Algernon begins and ends in a similar way. It's a way of speaking of the, I would say, key narrator. And when you first read it, you are confused. And when you read it in the end, you are just heartbroken. It's the same words, it's the same expressions, and yet the effect has taken a 180-degree like turn, and it's so fascinating. I'm going to ponder over this other thing you said, which is expressions hit people based on novelty, and a lot of virality is novelty. So fabulous. And we reevaluate expressions per generations. Oh, chef's kiss perfection. Like, I'm going to reevaluate this. My Sunday is absolutely made. Thank you.